Today I have a very interesting game for you. Magnus Carlsen going old school, busting out the King's Gambit, taking us back to the 19th century when this opening was all the rage, and he's up against a Grandmaster by the name of Marcus Roger from Austria, rated 2800 in Blitz on chess.com, and who opted to decline the Gambit. Traditionally, the most popular thing to do here would be to play e takes f4, accepting the pawn. But what does white get in return? Well, they get quick development with knight to f3, d4, and this was actually used by Boris Spassky to beat Bobby Fischer back in the 60s, which prompted Fischer to respond by writing an article about how he had refuted the King's Gambit, and the line that he gives after knight f3 begins with the move d6. And then he gave a whole long variation which supposedly showed why this gambit is refuted. And I'm actually going to review Bobby Fischer's analysis after the game with Stockfish, so stick around for that. It's going to be very interesting to see if this gambit is really refuted or not. But in the game, Marcus did not take the pawn, didn't want to go down that theoretical rabbit hole, and he just struck in the center with the move d5. Magnus responds with knight to f3. Now if black were to take on e4 here, then the knight would grab on e5. That's not great. So e takes f4 is played. It's the best move. Magnus takes on d5. And should black play queen takes d5 and allow knight to c3 with tempo on the queen? No. That's why knight to f6 was played by Marcus. And the best here for white would be c4. This is not what Carlsen played. Not because you want to hang on to this pawn, but you just want to make black work a little harder to get it. Best move for black is c6, attack the pawn further. And you're not going to take on c6 and help black with his development. You're going to play d4. Point is, after c takes d5, you're not going to capture on d5, you're going to play c5. Controlling d6, so there's no bishop to d6 for black, which is going to make it very easy for you to pick up the f pawn. And the engines say in this position is about equal. But Magnus in the game played bishop to e2, which the engine doesn't like at all, thinks it's way too tame, makes life too easy for black, who just picks up the pawn on d5. And now we have an even worse move from Magnus, c4. You might say, what's wrong with that? You're kicking the knight off its central square, you're taking control in the center. Well, the problem lies with the move that Marcus did not play, and that would have been knight to b4, targeting this d3 square. You don't want the knight hopping into there, blockading your d-pawn, so you really need to play d4 now, but then here comes bishop to f5, targeting c2. Can't allow this fork, so the only reasonable defense here is knight to a3, blocking your a-pawn, so you're not going to be able to kick that knight out of there. And as white, you're kind of tied up, defending c2, your knight's on the rim, and black now has time to play g5, hang on to his f-pawn, for which white has no compensation. Black is the much better side here. But Marcus did not see that idea. Instead of playing knight b4, he just dropped the knight back to e7. Now we have d4 from Magnus, opening up the bishop to take the pawn on f4. Knight to g6 defends, opens up this diagonal for his bishop so he can castle soon. We have castles, bishop to e7, all decent moves, knight to c3, castles. And now Magnus jumping into d5, hitting this pawn with the second piece. Now there's no reason for black not to just defend here with bishop to d6. Right? And you might say, well, c5 can kick the bishop. Well, then we counterattack with c6. And then if c takes d6, we're going to take the knight here. This pawn's going to get picked up. That's how black should play. But instead, we had knight to c6 from Marcus, allowing knight takes f4. White has now equalized. Now we have knight takes f4. Probably not the best. I think he didn't want the knight to jump back to d5, but this does allow white to get another piece into the game, which hadn't yet moved, so white is kind of jumping ahead in development here. It would have been better to play something like bishop f5, but okay, now we have bishop to g4, threatening to take on f3 and then win this pawn here, so the pawn is pushed to d5, but this does allow bishop to c5 with check. Bishop's getting a little more active, while also clearing the e7 square for the knight. So after king to h1, we have knight to e7. And at this point, Magnus, being Magnus, notices that the black king side is looking a little bare. He's only got these three pawns shielding his king, and all the white minor pieces are on the king side, so this is kind of a recipe for attack. Magnus begins the attack with knight to g5, which is a discovered attack on the bishop here. So bishop takes e2, queen takes e2. Now we have knight to g6. It's a good move. It's hitting that bishop on f4. But does Magnus move it? No, because he's got queen to h5. Which threatens mate in 1, has to be addressed, and it's addressed with h6, which sets up a nice little tactic for Magnus. See if you can spot it. Can you guess what Magnus played in this position? 3, 2, 1. Knight takes f7, removing the defense of this knight here. And this is similar to a variation in the French defense, I believe, where a similar kind of thing happens. Probably some other openings too. Whenever you have this knight on g6 and you have this mate threat with the queen and knight, forcing black to play h6, it's a good pattern to remember. Now you can try to hang on to your knight with king to f7, you know it defends, but this is a disaster after bishop takes c7 check. That's a discovery. You're going to lose your queen. So the best move here would just be rook takes f7, allowing the knight to drop off. And white's got an extra pawn at this point, but you can start applying pressure with queen to f8, pinning this bishop, threatening to win it. Best move is to defend. Then you can add more pressure with bishop to e3. Then the queen can drop back to defend. Kind of looks like white can hold on to his extra pawn for a while, but black's applying a lot of pressure and the position is equal. But this is not what was played in the game. Instead, Marcus throws in this knight takes f4, trying to be tricky, I guess. It hits the queen, so rook takes f4, and his idea was queen to e7, attacking this knight twice, but there's no problem. Magnus just puts another rook behind it, and at this point, black is already hopelessly lost. There's a big threat here involving queen to g6. There's not a good way to stop that move, and the threat is just going to be knight takes h6 with check, taking advantage of the fact that this pawn will be pinned. And just take a look at the position and ask yourself, how does black deal with that? It's surprisingly hard to find a defense. The engine is giving bishop to e3 here, just getting this bishop on this diagonal as soon as possible, hitting the rook, but you can still take on h6 as white. Of course, since the queen hasn't made it to g6 yet, pinning this pawn, black can capture on h6, that's the best move, but then you got queen to g6 check. If the king moves, then you're going to take this pawn and then you're going to bring this rook over. It's going to be checkmate, I think, pretty quick. So black really has to put the queen in the way. And then here you have queen to e6 check, picking up the bishop on e3. That's the line the engine gives, but it's hopeless for black because black is now 2 pawns down. But let's compare that to what was played in the game. This whole idea of queen to g6 wasn't even addressed. Marcus puts his rook on e8. The queen goes into g6, and what are you doing about this? The king cannot move, doesn't have a square. So Marcus plays queen to e2. Maybe he's trying to get tricky with bishop to f2, something like that. But here comes knight takes h6, check, king moves, okay. Knight back to f7, check, king goes to g8. Knight to h6, check, king to h8. Are we going to have a repetition? Oh no, we're going to have knight to f5. Threatening checkmate in 1 on g7. And where's the defense? You want to defend with the queen? Well, that's a mate in 3. With rook to h4 check, king to g8, knight to e7 check, bishop takes, and queen to h7 mate. So what else can you try? Rook g8? Well, that's a mate in 2. Rook h4, queen to h5, rook takes queen. So black really has no choice but to play what was played in the game, rook takes f5. And after rook takes f5, Marcus had to resign. He's down the exchange, but that is not the worst thing about his position. Magnus is threatening to come in here with check and follow that with queen to h7, which will be checkmate. Black really has no defense. What's the engine saying? It's saying sacrifice the queen. That's the best way to prolong the game, and this is still a checkmate in 18, according to the engine. So a very nice performance by Magnus, making it look easy with the old school King's Gambit. And as promised, I'm going to take a look at this Gambit and its supposed refutation by the great Bobby Fischer with the help of what some people say is the most powerful chess entity in the universe, Stockfish 16. Let's go back to this moment here where Bobby Fischer says yes, black does take the pawn and will go on to win by force. White plays knight to f3, and the move that Bobby says black should play here, which he calls a high-class waiting move, is d6. Quite impressive, since this is Stockfish 16's top choice, and it's kind of a tame-looking move. So it shows he's given this some deep analysis and gives bishop to c4 as the main line for white. The engine agrees. Bobby gives h6, Stockfish agrees, but this is where their agreement ends. Black is preparing g5, try to hang on to his pawn. Bobby gives d4 as the main line, which I'm sure was the most popular move pre-engine days, but Bobby Fischer completely overlooked the move that Stockfish gave here, which is simply h4. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds analyzing the variations. From here on out, I'm basically just going to show you what Stockfish thinks and the analysis that Bobby Fischer gives. because this gets insanely complicated. Maybe in a future video, I'll go over all these variations in more detail and try to understand them. But let me just show you what Stockfish says is best play for both sides in the King's Gambit. Starts with this move h4 that Bobby Fischer didn't even talk about. I don't know why he didn't consider this, since it just stops g5. But Stockfish says the game should continue like this. And I'll just go through these moves very quickly. And if you want an answer to the question, does the King's Gambit lose by force? It appears that it does not. For after this variation, we have both sides, I believe, castling on the queen side. Very interesting. Black does hang on to his extra pawn for a long time, but white here has some compensation. And this is very deep analysis. I got a lot of this from the cloud. So this is Stockfish 16 analyzing to a depth of like 50 or more. And this is where I stopped. And the engine says the position is like a quarter of a pawn in black's favor. So if you believe Stockfish, the King's Gambit is far from being busted. But let's get back to Bobby Fischer's supposed refutation, just completely ignoring h4, which is what white should play, and instead he gives this move d4, allowing black to get in his g5, and for some reason says here that white should castle, which the engine just hates. I think it's saying that you can still play h4. It's not as good of a version now, playing it at this stage, but it's much better than castling. I mean, I don't see why white should be castling into this kind of thing. Of course, black doesn't play g4 quite yet, but what we have from Fischer is this bishop to g7 move. He gives some good analysis here. Most of these moves are accurate, but there are some severe inaccuracies coming up here. Okay, so we have knight to c6, queen to b3 targeting f7, the queen defends, and at this point Fischer gives the move h4. What happens if you take? Okay, so the bishop will just take here on f4. I think he said you can push the pawn, and that is winning for black, but he went down the more main line, which is knight to f6 for some reason, allowing the pawn exchange here, and white grabs like this. And things really get crazy here, and this just goes to show just how much the engine has revolutionized chess. Now here Fischer gives an inaccurate move, knight takes e4, which the engine says just completely throws away the winning advantage for black. What you're supposed to play is knight takes d4 or knight to g4. And I'm going to show you how this knight takes d4 move works in a minute. After knight takes e4, apparently you just take with the knight and white equalizes. But Fischer did not give the response, knight takes e4. He said white should play bishop takes f7 check, which is a mistake and gives the win back to black. Apparently this has to do with the fact that you're allowing the king to get off of the open file. In the following line, king to d8, and now if you take on e4, black can play this crazy move which Fischer missed, knight takes d4. You don't capture on e4. If c takes d4, then bishop takes d4 check is really bad for white. You can block with the knight, but then queen to h4. There's a forced checkmate in 6 moves. Now that knight takes d4 doesn't work if the king is still on this square here. Let's compare that to taking on e4 right away with knight takes like this. Now if black tries this, you're going to play queen to d1. Yeah, because the queen was hit. And now the winning move for black here would have been queen takes e4, but then you have the rook pinning the queen to the king. That apparently is why that bishop takes f7 check was a mistake. But okay, this just goes to show how supposedly deep analysis by humans doesn't even compare to what the engine can see in just seconds. It realizes immediately that this bishop takes f7 check was the losing blunder for white, king to d8, and then Bobby gives this move knight takes e4, just completely missing this idea of knight takes d4 here, which would win for black, the only winning move, by the way. And Bobby gives queen takes e4, and then he says bishop takes f4 for white, and now he sees knight takes d4. He gives this move at this point, and this is where his article ends, and then he just, I guess he feels that it's obvious that black is winning here, which it shouldn't be, because Stockfish says that white just completely equalizes with bishop to g5 check. And after king to d7, queen to c4, pinning this knight here to the queen. You do have a check, the king goes to f2, and this is supposedly a draw. Why exactly, I can't tell you, because it's pretty complicated. But at a later date, I do want to analyze this opening more deeply and just get to the bottom of all these crazy variations by Stockfish. But I think we can safely say the King's Gambit is not dead. There is probably still so much to be learned about it. It would be interesting if this opening experienced a revival. Maybe if Magnus Carlsen plays it enough, that will happen. But thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, subscribe to the channel. I will see you on the next one.